Hello.
Welcome back to the Space Gulag, otherwise known as PBSW, your favorite Hero Plus Star, back with another Star Wars story. Today we'll discover what would have happened had Cassian Andor joined the Empire. For those of you that have not seen Andor, spoilers for the first 4 episodes within the first 10 minutes of the video. Before we begin this video, special thanks to our patrons, voice actors, and everyone else part of the Pente Patrol team. If you want a chance to win in our next giveaway, watch the end of the video and I will tell you exactly how you can win a free lightsaber. Our story begins on the planet of Kenari, where a young boy moves with his tribe to a crashed location. The tribe surrounded the crash site as they examined it. There were weird markings all across the ship's hull. The young boy's tribe leader walked down to investigate the area as she was shot in the back by a blaster of one of the crew members of the ship. The tribe all shot out of their pipes little darts that smacked into the back of the crew member. The crew member tumbled down to the ground as he was filled with little darts. The tribe ran down to gather the girl who led them to the crash site. The tribe picked her up and took her back to camp. Cassian, on the other hand, didn't. He went inside of the crashed ship to investigate. He'd never seen such high tech here on Kenari. Most of all he knew was tribal life, sticks and stones. Cassian walked around the ship, looking around at the different panels and the dead bodies. He was a very confused boy. This was a planet that lacked very much contact off-world, especially since the mining facilities had been closed down nearby. This ship seemed to be cursed with some sort of virus of some sorts. Cassian wasn't really sure, but all the dead bodies were turned yellow. Though while Cassian was rummaging around the ship, he ran into 2 people who took him with them. These people were here on behalf of the Empire. The ship that went down was plagued with a disease that wiped out the entire crew. Cassian was very confused, but the people that were here inside of the ship from the Empire knew that they couldn't leave him behind, so they kindly brought the boy back with them to their vessel, a vessel heading back to the capital of the galaxy, Coruscant. The young boy wouldn't be brought to a normal family. Instead, he would be dropped off at an adoption agency and left behind by the people that brought him here. For the young Cassian, this was a bit of a wild experience. Everyone around him spoke a different language, one that he had never heard before. Cassian sat inside of the adoption agency looking around at the people passing in and out nearby him. He was just a young boy. He had only known Kenari, and so far Coruscant was insane. Kenari had jungles, and Coruscant's jungles were made of concrete. Cassian enjoyed the view from the window that he sat down by. He looked over and he could see a massive temple of sorts with 5 smaller towers shooting out from it. Cassian looked into the skies and saw lanes of traffic speeding back and forth. His eyes lit up as he looked into the skyline of Coruscant. A voice called out, but Cassian didn't respond, because he was too fixated on what he was not aware of, and he didn't know he was being called on. The lady tapped on Cassian's shoulder, and he jumped, and turned around and looked at her. She waved her hands towards him, as Cassian understood this to mean to follow her. The two would walk to the center of the building, where a protocol droid was waiting. The woman told the droid that he would be adopted by an Imperial family. The people of the adoption agency wanted Cassian to fall in line with an Imperial family in hopes that he would join the Imperial Academy once he was given the chance. One of the families in the market for the little boy already had themselves a daughter. The father was an Imperial scientist stationed on Coruscant for a project in which he believed was sourcing alternate energy from kyber crystals. After the daughter was born, the mother wasn't able to have children, so the family decided to adopt a boy from Kenari, who was 5 years older than their daughter. It seemed like the right thing to do, and the Ersos were very involved in doing the right thing. For Andor, he would be welcomed into the household with a younger sister, and he would also be brought into an upper-class lifestyle here on Coruscant. Galen Erso was a highly respected Imperial scientist. He was convinced he was doing work for the galaxy, but he was being lied to about the intentions of the project by his friend Orson Krennic. Galen had plenty of time until he found out, but he was a smart man, and he was making headway on this project. Galen and Lyra Erso would welcome Andor the opportunity to join their family. Cassian wanted to know about his sister, but because the 2 parents didn't realize Cassian had a sister on Kenari, the 2 were overjoyed that Cassian was looking for a little sister, because they had their daughter, and that would be a little sister for him. Cassian was super excited, but when he got to their home to find Jyn Erso, he was very confused. He thought the sister he was going to find was going to be the one he had on Kenari. A protocol droid was owned by the family, and the parents would begin to try and teach Galactic Common to Cassian. Though through the first few weeks of Cassian's time with the Ersos, the parents would come to understand that Cassian had a sister back on Kenari. The Ersos were wealthy enough to send someone out to find her, but by the time they got there, the tribe had disappeared, and the people the Ersos paid to find her couldn't find her. This was an early blow to Cassian. He wanted to have his sister back, and now he was on the verge of a new life without his sister and inside of a wealthy household. Luckily, Cassian was a very bright young boy. The protocol droid in him got past galactic common quickly, and Cassian was able to speak in full sentences to his new family. At this point, Cassian was 10 and the girl he was now siblings with was 5. The two of them were around the same place when it came to understanding of galactic common and other things that were being taught in the wealthier side of Coruscant. Jyn and Cassian didn't really get too close. The 5-year age difference made the two of them a little bit distanced from one another. Also, whenever Orson Krennic was over to visit Galen, Jyn would be put to bed and Cassian was allowed to stay out. Cassian and Orson got along really well with one another. Krennic was partially trying to see if Cassian would become something similar to that of his adopted father. As the months continued to progress since Cassian's adoption, he became extremely well-spoken and well-understanding of galactic common knowledge. Their systems of math, science, language, history, his acceleration was rather surprising, especially since he was from a tribe on Kenari. As Cassian got smarter, his adopted parents and he got closer. Of course, it would never be the same as having a real set of parents, but the fact that Cassian felt a close bond with the people who adopted him was incredibly important for his early development. There was also something that Cassian had a hard time differentiating through, though, and it was the adopted parents' political views in comparison to that of the overly loyal Orson Krennic. The Ersos were obviously patriotic enough for Galen to work for the Empire, but as a scientist, Galen worked for the Empire so that he could help the people of the galaxy. Galen thought his energy project with kyber crystals would be used for the betterment of the galaxy. Other than that, the Ersos weren't exactly enthralled with the direction of the Empire since the fall of the Republic. It had only been 3 years since the Purge of the Jedi, the end of the Clone Wars, and the rise of the Empire. The year was 16 BBY, and because of the Chancellor becoming Emperor, Galen and Lyra didn't support the Empire. Orson Krennic bought into the whole system of Imperial patriotism, but on the other hand, he was trying to work his way up the ladder. He'd seen it work and happen with someone he knew at that one point being Tarkin. Tarkin spiraled up the ladder incredibly fast because he was loyal to the Emperor. Krennic tried to do the same thing. Krennic also aspired to have the same growth in his own professional career, and because of his hyperfixation on promotion, he became enthralled with the Empire. Galen didn't buy into this as much, and this was also a benefit of him having a family to care for. Orson didn't have a wife and kids. He was a lone wolf, and so his work life became the only thing he cared about, and his primary focus in life. Early on, Cassian would be able to notice the difference between Galen and Orson. The two predominant male role models in his life were exceedingly different, but for Cassian, he found a great enthusiasm for the Empire. Once he understood galactic common and caught back up to where he should be in school, he was entered into a prestigious Coruscant school. From the school came senators, Imperial admirals, great business owners, and the best of the best from the Imperial and what was formerly Republic society. Galen, Orson, and Lyra all attended this school, and they met late into secondary school. This school was well known around the galaxy for the students it pumped out of it. But those who went to this school had to work very hard. The benefits of attending this school for Cassian was that he would be informed more about the galaxy he lived in. From this school, he would also begin to adopt a patriotism for the Empire. Emperor Palpatine enacted a law in place early into his rule as Emperor that all the school systems galaxy-wide focus on an output of pro-Imperial teachings. This would see some of the teachers and lecturers of schools around the galaxy extradited for teaching their views on the fall of the Republic and the Jedi themselves, considering there were those who loved the Jedi and those who loved the rise of the Empire within the school system. But within the first 3 years of Palpatine's reign, most of those with a tolerance towards the Jedi were forced out of the education system. This was extremely prevalent within the core worlds, which had all of its children taught to be pro-Imperial. Of course, in the older grades, the students challenged their professors because they saw the fall of the Republic, but the professors would usually be able to make their point against these young individuals. Within Cassian's grade, there was very little pushback. All the children were very easily influenced. Because they were all very easily influenced, the Imperial professors had no issue with teaching them, unless their parents supported the Jedi or the Republic. Most of the people at this school had influential Imperial families though, most of which were perfectly fine with the switch from Republic to Empire. For several more months, Cassian would thrive within the upper class of society. As the son of an Imperial scientist, he had the rare opportunity to interact with high-ranking Imperials on a weekly basis. Most of these Imperials saw a lot of potential in the young boy, but they didn't know that while he was extremely bright and well-versed in galactic common after having grown up on Kenari, he was a bit of a rebel, with rebellious tendencies. He liked to sneak out of the house from time to time, but once he was caught, he chilled with the excessive tendencies to sneak out. Cassian would also be taken in by his adopted father and learn the importance of family and the importance of sticking around and being a good influence for his little sister. This was something that struck home with Cassian. He realized that he would have to treat Jin like his little sister, because she in a certain way looked up to him. They'd become closer as siblings since he was adopted, and the two of them got along pretty well with one another. Cassian would spend the duration of the next couple months in school with the ability to go on field trips, 2 of them to be exact. One to Alderaan to see what the Pride of the Corps was all about, and with the ability to go to Kuat and see the pride of the Imperial infrastructure program. Both field trips built a certain level of inspiration and patriotism in the Empire for Cassian. Alderaan was a very liked world within the galaxy, and taking a trip there made Cassian want to move to a core world that had the elegance and beauty of the same world that he grew up on. Cassian's excitement for the Empire built. As a boy, he could see himself in a future for the Empire. But after another year on Coruscant, his father would tell the family that they were leaving Coruscant. Cassian was 12 and his adopted sister was 7. Galen expressed that to Lyra of his discontentment with the Empire because he found out that they were using his work for weapons of mass destruction. While he had no clue the Death Star was a long-term goal, he put his notice in, and within 2 weeks, he and his family would have to relocate. Imperial jobs paid really well, but once you left the job, you lost the home that you lived in that was funded by the Empire. It was alright because Galen and Lyra had planned for this, and there was a nice world out in the galaxy that they could move out to and begin their new life. The planet was called Lamu, and it was a perfect world for farming. So, a man with his talents and his beautiful little family would move to Lamu and 14 BBY. Cassian was the most distressed by the move, because he finally made some friends and he was relatively popular within his school. He had a unique accent and he looked much different than most of his peers. He had a wit and he had great stories that no one else had or could tell. Cassian was really quite upset that he was being taken away from Coruscant. He loved the bougie lifestyle and he didn't want to lose it. This would receive a stern talk from his adopted father that he wouldn't necessarily appreciate immediately. But once they all moved to Lamu, he would come around to understand why Galen and Lyra moved. Both of the parents understood why Cassian would react as such. He'd seen a lot of radical change so early on in his life, especially within the last 3 years, and there was plenty of reason for him to lash out after adjusting finally to a lifestyle that he was gifted on Coruscant. Galen never saw Cassian's actions as selfish, but he did see them as disrespectful, and the father-son duo had a level of respect for one another. The response from Cassian broke that level of respect, but the respect would be rebuilt once they arrived at their new homestead. The two of them would rebuild their respect by going out into the fields of their new farm and scouting out the land so that they could decide what they were going to do with it. Galen had plans to grow mellyrunes. They sold great on the galactic market, and even better, he was going to do some moisture farming as well, which would do great on Lamu. For the next year and a half, the Ersos family would find success as farmers. But in 13 BBY, right after Cassian's birthday, they'd be visited by Orson Krennic. The family would send the 2 children, and Lyra, to their hidden bunker. Though on the way there, Lyra would turn around, while Galen was trying to convince Orson of the death of his wife, which Orson knew was a blatant lie. Krennic would send his death troopers out to scout out the area to find the Erso family. This would result in the quick and immediate death of Lyra. The gunshots would lead Cassian to push his sister towards the little bunker until Saw Gerrera got there. Cassian turned around to make sure his parents were okay. When he got to the location of the gunshots, he saw his mother laying on the ground, unconscious. Cassian cried out and ran towards his body. As he got close, he was picked up by a death trooper. Galen yelled out as he told the death trooper to put the boy down. Krennic told Galen that he and Cassian would be coming with him. There would be no discussion, no argument, nor debate about it. They were coming back with him to Coruscant because the Empire needed Galen to finish his work. Galen would get a hold of Cassian and look him in the eyes. Cassian would nod his head, as if to tell his father that Jyn was able to get away safe. Cassian and Galen would be forced into a ship, and they would be taken right back to Coruscant. Galen was forced into an Imperial science wing, and Krennic pushed Cassian back into the school system he was originally in. Cassian was worried about his little sister, and he was very saddened for the loss of his mother. He was also very discombobulated because he very rarely got to see his father. Cassian enjoyed the popularity that returned to his life, but he began to stop seeing how great the Empire was. He still was taught to believe everything the Empire had was better than what the Republic had, but the treatment his adopted family was given made him feel differently about this opinion. Krennic would specifically spend a lot more time around Cassian to try and convince him of the more patriotic side of the Empire. Since Cassian was still very young, there was a good chance Krennic could leave a lasting effect on the very influenced boy. Krennic, more than anything, was trying to recruit Cassian to the Empire. He believed he'd be a useful asset, especially within the Imperial Army or Navy. It was because Cassian had shown a lot of resilience at a young age, and Imperial officers could use someone like him to lead them. Though the issue at the moment was the fact that Cassian was very angry at the Empire, and especially at Krennic, but without the ability to spend time with Galen, or remember his mother, who he lost, or his little sister, who was most likely with Saw Gerrera, young Cassian became very depressed. Sure, he was still the same popular Cassian he was at school, but returning home, he didn't have a lavish lifestyle. His home life was tragic compared to what he used to have, and to what all of his peers currently had. Cassian lived alone at the rightful age of 13. He was surrounded by protocol droids. They were Imperial models, and so every time Cassian yelled aloud about his predicament, the droids would scold him for his anger towards the Empire. Cassian knew it wasn't the droids' fault, it was their programming, but it didn't make him feel any better. Because the Empire specialized in inhumane mental games, the protocol droids would slowly begin to make Cassian question everything he knew to be true. They would push back at him every time he showed rebellious tendencies. When Cassian was first brought back to Coruscant, he cried himself to sleep every night. As the weeks picked up and his visitation with Galen became more and more infrequent, Cassian's tears began to dry. His thoughts and free will began to dwindle as Krennic and his band of protocol droids forced his young boy into a machine. Because of Cassian's age, the ability to conform him to Imperial standards was quite easy. For someone like Galen, it would be especially difficult, even more so because Galen understood what was at stake if he gave it all up. Galen needed to be at the top of his game so that he could design a weapon and also design the hole that would bring its downfall. It was a perfectly curated plan, but it had to be brought to life. All the while, Galen played his part of the madman reserved to his studies. As Cassian grew through primary school into Imperial secondary school, Krennic forced him down a path without his knowledge. Most students, when they entered secondary school, had the ability to choose their path in life, or their broad area of study. When Cassian got here, he was also given that same choice, just not as broad as any of his other classmates. Cassian would be put into a militaristic program that focused on Imperial military, history, politics, and just about anything else that would help brainwash a young man into serving the Imperial hierarchy. Cassian's classes were very focused on pro-Empire propaganda, and this is where Cassian would begin to hear the name of Saw Gerrera for the first time since the death of his mother and the abandonment of his sister. Cassian listened in, ready to challenge everything the professor said to him, but what he heard and saw would only break his heart. Cassian had known Saw Gerrera personally, and he came to really like him, but the Imperial professor showed what Saw was capable of. There weren't calculated assaults on Imperial bases because it didn't matter who got in the crossfire. Civilians often paid the price of Saw's sins. Cassian watched the projector show images of what he'd done to cities and towns. The professor continued by saying that during the Clone Wars, Saw Gerrera was aided by the Republic to free his people. And when the Republic became an empire, he lost his mind. Cassian, on the other hand, knew about the death of Saw's sister, and he thought about asking, but he knew it would be to no use. Cassian saw that Saw was capable of doing. After another day of seeing what someone he looked up to could do, Cassian returned to his home and looked in the mirror. He stood in the reflection of himself for several hours, trying to figure out what was worth doing. An intense amount of sadness rang down throughout the boy. He knew he wouldn't be able to escape like his sister had. The protocol droids were always on, and there was consistently an armed guard outside of Cassian's little apartment. There was no balcony, and the windows on his high-rise didn't open. Cassian still had a beautiful view he had become accustomed to, just without the warm family to be by his side. Cassian thought of what he could do. He realized the Empire was in the wrong, but surely there had to be a way to defy the Empire. He knew Krennic wouldn't loosen the leash unless he proved to him that he would support the Empire. And then Cassian got a brilliant idea. He would become a rebel within the Empire. Sure, the Empire was so proud of itself that rebels could just get in by acting like they belonged, but if Cassian belonged, then he, much like his father, could become a very useful asset to any rebel cells, like Saul's band of rebels. While Cassian didn't know his father was helping, he did know the type of man his father was, and Cassian had to live up to what he believed his father would do. So, for the next several years, Cassian would play the part. He would wear the straight, unfathomed face of a young Imperial man. He would get good grades, and he would continuously be well liked by his peers. Cassian would become closer with Krennic in order to play the game. As Cassian got good at that game, he realized that being a typical Imperial wouldn't be enough. Cassian was so good at the game that he decided he would strive for a grand position, whether that be a director of scientific projects like Krennic, a general, an admiral, or a grand admiral, maybe even a Moff or a grand Moff would suffice. Regardless, Cassian realized the power that Imperial officials had by undergoing the treatment he received from Krennic. So, Cassian's grand plan formed. He had no way of writing it down or saving it in all holotags. While he wasn't told he was being tapped and watched at every moment of the day, he figured it out. When he was a boy who reacted out of fear and anger, he figured out that he was always being watched. So Cassian learned how to keep a secret. He learned how to be a rebel in his own world under constant surveillance. Though there was one thing Cassian knew would push him to his limits, and it was the fact that becoming a high-ranking Imperial meant one had to brown nose. Cassian hated sucking up to people, and he would have to do it in order to reach a high level. Considering Krennic was soaring through his promotions and his peers weren't, proved to Cassian that the loyalist individuals always won, while those who served casually had a plateau of how high they could grow in their career. Most of the highest-ranking Imperials had to forfeit having a family in order to reach a certain level. Cassian was in luck though. Because of his constant good grades since he was 13, he was able to get great placement into an Imperial program of his choice. It was a hard choice. The Imperial Navy was the easiest to excel through. Imperial Army would be a hassle because he'd have to lead the Imperial Army, not stormtroopers, until he won enough battles to be able to lead stormtroopers. Most people who joined the Imperial Army never saw stormtroopers under their command because the Imperial Army was put into the mud to suppress local planets, whose people knew the landscape better than the Empire. As for becoming a Moff, it would require a lot of political savvy, something that came rather naturally to Cassian. Well, it wasn't political savvy, but it was just the savvy wit of a boy who'd been through more than enough in one lifetime. The position that would also rival the difficulty of an Imperial Army was becoming a scientific director, like Krennic. It was the same position that Krennic was shooting for. As Cassian could see, Krennic was already graying. Cassian believed he could have the greatest effect in the Imperial Navy. One, because it was incredibly easy to progress through the ranks of the Navy. All you had to do was throw someone in front of the sandcrawler, and you could progress your career without much issue. So, Cassian followed this formula to perfection when he joined the ranks of the Imperial Navy. Because of the prestigious school he came from and the grades he acquired, he entered the Imperial Navy as a lieutenant commander. It was the highest rank that one could achieve coming out of secondary school, and it required perfect placement on the Imperial Naval exam, and it also required a grade average higher than anyone else's in one's class. Because Cassian was able to achieve this feat, he became the first individual from the school to achieve the rank since an admiral that served during the Clone Wars had. Cassian was highly respected, and having a name like Ersos as his last name gave him an extra bonus. For those in the Imperial Navy that knew of Galen, or knew what Galen was working on in Project Stardust, they were exceedingly excited to welcome Cassian to their ranks. Cassian knew he had to do one thing if he were to become an Imperial. He had to play the game of a vile man. This wasn't easy because Cassian was a caring individual, though the last several years took away some of that care. Cassian's goal was to become the downfall of the Empire, but he wanted to do it in a way that was better than how the Empire did it or how Saw Gerrera did it. Cassian didn't want civilians to become targets, but there was always a fear that they would become targets under his command. Cassian knew his place in this scheme, and he knew that he would have to play the game right. Though instead of going through a massive, more intensive study as a lieutenant commander, Cassian would be sent out to shadow under an Imperial captain. It wasn't the next rank up, but if he shadowed with a captain, it wouldn't be long before Cassian was given the opportunity to become a captain himself. Cassian would be taken off of Coruscant and be sent to be with one of the several Imperial fleets in the galaxy. The fleet he was deployed to was over Mimban. The planet 2 years before was besieged. It was also the same location where a young man by the name of Han Solo escaped the planet with a Wookiee prisoner. The natives of Mimban were still rebellious, which is why the Empire left an Imperial Star Destroyer and 2 acquaintances over the planet, with 3 smaller Gazanti cruisers to aid and support. As a lieutenant commander, Cassian was placed on the command bridge of the Imperial Star Destroyer, where he would spend the next 5 months. The bridge of a Star Destroyer is where all the action happened. The captain of the ship, in this fleet, was the leader of the fleet. He controlled movements, rotations, bombarding options, shipments of supplies, everything you could really think about. The captain of the Mimban fleet kept his eyes on Cassian. While most Imperial officers weren't the brightest, this captain led a successful mission on Mimban, and he let the success go to his head. Mimban was a 6-month siege, so he had every reason to be prideful of his achievements during the campaign, but the fact that he was stuck on Mimban 2 years after the campaign ended, he was getting impatient and he began to lash out at others because of it. His impatience is what kept him here. The admiral of the fleet that promoted the captain during the Mimban campaign only promoted him because he was eager to win. The admiral knew that he would become troublesome once the campaign was over, and ensured that he would stay over the planet indefinitely. Part of the reason the Imperial Academy on Coruscant sent the 18-year-old Cassian to Mimban was so that he could replace his captain. He was a great annoyance to the people on deck, and a lot of formal complaints were placed against this captain. The captain knew that Cassian was likely sent here to replace him, so he's going to do everything in his power to ensure that Cassian didn't replace him. This was done by setting Cassian up for failures. Whenever there was a late patrol, the captain would always begin to blame Cassian for the failures, though the commander on deck knew that the captain was doing something wrong. The captain would find loopholes, like specifically order the fleet out of position at a certain hour of the night when the lieutenant commander was the commander on deck. But every time this happened, Cassian would acknowledge what was happening, deny the orders, and then place a formal report. It wouldn't take long until a squad of death troopers were sent to Mimban on the request of the newly promoted Director Krennic. These death troopers would be sent here within the first 5 months of Cassian's stay, and he would see the execution of his boss, and then be ordered to fill the role, with a decree signed by the Emperor himself. Sure, it was most likely a throwaway signature that popped up on the desk of the Emperor that he signed and then sent along as he continued his intergalactic politics. For Cassian, he would be revered around his tiny little fleet for his ability to get rid of the former captain. He was extremely disliked, and his ability to make people's skin crawl eventually found him executed. Cassian, on the other hand, took the helm of his first Star Destroyer by surpassing the commander. The particular commander didn't mind. He was an older man who couldn't stand the former captain. Being a captain, especially at Mimban, came with a lot of responsibilities, so the commander was fine with Cassian receiving the promotion over him. Cassian's responsibilities would be heightened, but the opportunity to show off his knowledge as a young 19-year-old would come only a few months into his promotion. A band of pirates would perform a raid on an incoming shipment to Mimban. It was some sort of what was left of Crimson Dawn. Most of the criminal organization fell when the Empire destroyed it in 10 BBY, 2.5 years beforehand, but there was still someone who claimed to be their allegiance to the former criminal empire. This band of pirates sent a small rudimentary fleet after the shipment coming to Mimban. Cassian sent out 2 acquaintances to provide cover fire, while the 3 Gazantis provided support. 2 waves of TIE fighters would also be released from the hangar bay of the Star Destroyer, while the singular wing of TIE interceptors would be held back in reserve. Cassian stood at the helm of the bridge as he looked out and watched the shipping vessels try to avoid conflict. The first Imperial ships to the shipments was the TIE fighters, intended to arrive first. The pirate vessels pulled back as they saw the Imperial fleet closing in on them. Without a second thought, a vessel pulled out of hyperspace, and it sent Cassian into a state of shock. It was a fully functional Venator-class Star Destroyer, at the most 13 years old, and it was bearing down on Cassian's little fleet. Captain Ersos ordered the Star Destroyer to forward his thrusters and moved the support ships into a defensive formation that Cassian designed. The acquaintances would take the bulk of the assault, something that they could certainly handle, but not for long. The Star Destroyer would eventually get into range of the Venator and his heavy cannons opened up. Cassian ordered every single wing of TIE fighters to exit the Star Destroyer. 3 wings of TIE bombers, 1 more wing of TIE fighters, and the TIE interceptors would emerge from the hangar bays as they entered the combat zone. The Star Destroyer opened up as the Venator tried to hold its own. The support ships from the pirate fleet began to try and make moves on the Imperial fleet, but the Empire had too much going for them, as the small pirate fleet's ships crumbled in space. The Empire then mobilized around as the bombers laid their assault onto the Venator. The Empire pushed its assault hard, and the remaining Crimson Dawn members saw their failure begin, as they tried to pull their fleet away from the Empire, but it was too late. Their shields were down, and the Empire demolished the remaining pirates. The deck crew would let out a loud cheer as Captain Ersos placed a call into the shipment vessels to ensure that they could successfully land on Mimban. They could. It was a successful defense. Because of the success under Captain Ersos, he'd be permitted the opportunity to become a Rear Admiral. Cassian would certainly take advantage of the opportunity, but they would remove Cassian from Mimban, and he would be stationed over the newly constructed facility at Scarif. The facility was also built in 10 BBY, and the construction of the Death Star was moved here. Since Cassian and Galen were technically family, the Empire thought it would make sense to reunite father and son. Even though Galen didn't spend a whole lot of time at Scarif, there was one other benefit. The base at Scarif, which was controlled by General Ramda, housed the most important documents in the Empire, plans for everything the Empire was going to do. When Cassian arrived, he assumed command of the 2 Imperial Star Destroyers and would oversee the construction of the Shield Gate. The Shield Gate would protect the entire planet from an invasion if it came, though Cassian had other plans. When he and his father met for the first time in several years, it motivated Galen to continue his work on the Death Star. It was a perfect plan, but because Galen didn't have the same access as the Rear Admiral Cassian did, he gave Cassian an idea. The 2 of them would team up for the next couple of years and prepare for Scarif's downfall. Cassian told Galen that he hadn't heard from Jyn, but he had heard reports that she was bouncing in and out of the prisoner system. Cassian used his rank for great knowledge. The year was currently 5 BBY, the rebellion was just beginning, and Cassian and Galen would step up their plan that would take several years to complete. Within the next 5 years, the Rear Admiral Cassian Ersos would oversee the dysfunction of the Shield Gate. This would ensure that the only way into the planet couldn't be turned off. Cassian set this up in case the rebels made an assault on the base at Scarif. Cassian would also go down into the base on the ground, and with his security bypass, he would go into the security archives room. He knew that Project Stardust was the entire readout for the Death Star. Cassian knew what Galen was going to do with the project of Stardust, and how it would help the rebellion. Cassian had an idea of his own, so he copy and pasted every single Imperial document into Project Stardust. He continued to do this for the next 5 years so that it was continuously updated, so that once the rebels came to Scarif and they came for Project Stardust, which Cassian knew Jyn and the rebels would get a hold of, in accordance to what Galen told them, they would get a hold of all the information inside of the Imperial archives. The main goal for whenever Scarif happened was to give the rebels all the information they needed to take down the Empire. From 5 BBY to 0 BBY, Galen and Cassian would perfect their project. While the Death Star was moved from Scarif to Geonosis, the massive superstructure was completed. It was tested on Jedha City by Director Krennic. The Death Star was then taken over by Grand Moff Tarkin. There was nothing Krennic could do to stop it. He tried his best to test his luck with Vader, but that almost cost him his life. The difficult time for Krennic would continue until he was able to silence the voice from Idu. There was an individual who sent out Imperial pilots to Saw Gerrera. This individual was Galen Ersos. But since the Death Star was complete, and it was completely operational, Galen's entire scientific team would be executed, just for Krennic to monologue him. Through a series of events, Jyn would be able to say goodbye to her father before his death. Galen tried to tell her about what Cassian had done, but before he died, he didn't get the chance to. Within the span of 24 hours, Cassian would be sitting on the bridge of a Star Destroyer he helmed for the last 5 years at Scarif. He was reading reports about the attack at Idu that left Galen Ersos dead. Cassian had tears in his eyes when he heard the ship's alarms go off. Cassian ran from his captain's quarters as he turned the corner and rubbed his eyes. Cassian saw no one in the hallway he was in. In the distant corridors, there was troops running from side to side. Cassian made his way to the bridge as fast as he could. The sounds of the ship's alarms were deafening. He couldn't hear his boots on the hard floor, or the thoughts in his head. As Cassian came around the corner, he saw the ship's bridge windows. The sounds of a firefight could be heard from where he was. Cassian stormed onto the deck as one of the officers yelled out "Rear Admiral" on deck. The command deck stood and saluted as Cassian demanded everyone get to their battle stations. Cassian took in the situation unfolding in front of him. Cassian got to the middle of the bridge and noticed that it was a rebel fleet. Cassian then looked to his left, or the port side, as he noticed that the shield gate was still open. He knew it was working. His plan was underway, though he had to focus on how he would handle the rebel forces. Cassian knew he would continue to station the Imperial fleet and handle the battle more conservatively. He had 2 Star Destroyers, and they were both out of range of the rebel ships. The most the Empire could do if they wanted to protect the shield gate was keep the Imperial Star Destroyer stationed nearby. This is how Cassian wanted it. He wanted to stay disengaged from the rebel fleet for as long as possible, to ensure that the rebels could do as much damage as possible. Cassian called over the comlinks to the members of deck crews inside of the shield gate and the opposing Star Destroyer. Cassian ordered 5 squadrons of TIE fighters to be released, 1 from each of the Star Destroyers and 3 of the 7 inside of the shield gate to be released. The officers asked Cassian what he was planning. Cassian expressed that he was going to catch the rebel fleet off guard. It was a long-term plan that they needed to follow. As the battle in space intensified with TIE fighters engaging, the rebel fleet led by Admiral Raddus and Hera Syndulla. The battle inside the shield gate was going brilliantly for the rebellion. A squad of elite rebels led by Jyn Erso was sneaking through the Imperial lines and going through the main complex on the beach. It was a long-term plan, but essentially Jyn knew what she was looking for. When she and her team got to the tower, they immediately began looking for the documents. On the beaches, rebels were tearing through Imperial troopers, and X-Wings and Y-Wings were making short work of the AT-ACTs that were chasing around troops on the ground. The pilot sent by Galen Erso, Bodhi, was assisting the rebels by setting up a transmitting device to the rebel fleet. Because the shield gate was still open, the rebels had the perfect opportunity to send the transmission to the rebel fleet. Though for Cassian, his conservative defense would cost him, as he watched Y-Wings run down the lines of his ship, dropping ion torpedoes. This effort by the rebels would have his entire Star Destroyer disabled. Cassian knew this was a bad thing, but the tactic used by Admiral Raddus would have Cassian trying his hardest to get the ship back into functioning. The ship's engines went down and the entire capital ship was disabled, especially with the shields down. With the ship disabled, the escape pods wouldn't work. The only way of getting out of this was getting into a ship or getting the ship turned back on. Though when a Hammerhead corvette came up the starboard side, Cassian abandoned the bridge. He ran from the hangar bay, but it was far too away as a Star Destroyer slammed into the one right next to it. Without the ability to escape, the Star Destroyer would collide with the shield gate, and the 3 Imperial vessels exploded, and the entire shield that covered the planet of Scarif vanished. Cassian and the entirety of his crew were killed in the explosion. On the ground, most of Rogue's squadron was killed, but Jyn Erso was able to get the plans to the rebels, and unluckily for her, she was shot dead by Orson Krennic after she revealed who she was. Krennic didn't have any time to celebrate because moments later, the entire base at Scarif was detonated by the Death Star, killing everyone at the base, rebels and Imperials included. The rebel fleet was able to find a large escape, but the Death Star plans were given to some rebels as they made a great escape from Lord Vader. This escape would be harrowing, but it would see the Death Star plans in the hands of Leia Organa. The Tantive 4 would make an escape into hyperspace, where the plans from Stardust were given to R2-D2 and eventually would find themselves from Tatooine on Yavin 4. While the Death Star plans were discovered, there were several thousands of other files. Among those files was a message from Cassian to his little sister. The message was a letter of love for his young sister. Cassian was telling her how much he missed her and how much he wished for her to have the best in her life, telling her that once the rebellion won, he would leave the Empire so that they could rekindle their sibling bond. But since Cassian died on Scarif, he never got the chance to leave his enslavement with the Empire. And since Jyn died on Scarif, she would never get to know that her brother had survived their encounter from when they were children. Though for the rebellion, after the destruction of the Death Star, they would be prepared to face anything the Empire gave them. The rebellion, with Luke, Leia, Han, and Chewie, would be able to take the fight to the Empire and win the galactic civil war against the second Death Star that wasn't operational. The rebellion, after the death of the Emperor, would search for Exegol and destroy the entire Sith Temple, completing the legacy of the Chosen One and ending the rule of the Emperor forever. The New Republic would eventually grow in place of the Empire, and with democracy in the minds of the galaxy, the unsung heroes of the Galactic Civil War would be forgotten to time as the Ersos helped the galaxy find the first peace it had since before the Clone Wars. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our story. Again, special thanks to Benjamin Wells, Icy Raptor, Anakin003, and Gort for supporting the channel. Let's hit 2,000 likes on this so we can see what if Plo left the Order with Ahsoka. If you want to see what if, let me know below. I'll be in the comments about doing crossovers. Check out the Twitch, community Discord, and Patreon if you want to support me in other ways. And if you want to know how to win a free lightsaber, go down below. I have a link. You click on the link, you put your name on the link. I announce all the winners for the giveaway in videos, so it's not in the comment section. That is a spam. That's not me. All winners will be announced in videos. We're shooting for 50,000 subscribers. When we hit 50,000, I will give away 3 lightsabers. Let's talk about our story. So this story is certainly obviously inspired by Andor. Now, I could go into a whole talk about Andor, and I won't because I know not everyone has seen it. All I will say is I think the show is fantastic. I love the show. It's an amazing, beautiful show, and it's a testament to what Star Wars can really be, especially when they don't talk about the Force or anything like that. And that's something I wanted to take advantage of here. Obviously, I had to mention the Jedi because if you grow up on Coruscant or you're on Coruscant, the Jedi Temple is right there, and it's going to be well known. But I wanted to avoid the Force and the Jedi as much as possible. And I also wanted to tell a story about someone that isn't as popular in Star Wars, someone that is a side character, essentially. And that's who Cassian is. He's not a main character in the Skywalker saga. He's a main character from Rogue One, and yes, he has his own show, which I do adore. But Andor, I think this video gave me a unique opportunity to tell a story about how someone little, someone that's not large in the story, can have a greater effect on the story. And I think that's the beauty of Rogue One as a story and as a movie, is that it shows these people that aren't known, that aren't talked about, and they're just kind of referenced by Rogue Squadron or Rogue One, and their acknowledgement in the series is only by Rogue Squadron. That's all you get from them in the Skywalker saga. The only recognition they get is Rogue One, and it's a bunch of characters, no-name characters, that go and save the rebellion. And I think that's the whole point of the rebellion. You know, Hera, Syndulla, and the Ghost Squadron, they're not mentioned. Of course they weren't made, and of course Rogue Squadron and Rebels weren't made before the original trilogy. Obviously we all know that, but it's the importance of having characters that aren't our main characters, that aren't main characters in the original trilogy, playing a part in the original trilogy and helping the original trilogy happen. And that's kind of what I wanted to do here. I wanted to kind of replicate that same feeling that not only Andor gives, but that Rogue One gives, by giving off these characters, and a character specifically in Cassian that exists inside of Imperial society, that isn't a farm boy, isn't a princess, isn't a smuggler. I'm talking about a guy that grows up on Kenari, who gets the chance of a lifetime to grow up on Coruscant, and he grows up on Coruscant for a good 3 years until he gets pushed out and moves to Lamu, and he becomes a farmer, right? And he does the whole thing with with Galen and the Ersos, and I thought having him go with the Ersos and be put in the Ersos family would give him a unique story, and also tell a unique story as well. Now, I know that Cassian and Jyn have probably a shipping thing going on, and I wanted to avoid that at all costs. I think they would just be siblings, and that's what I wanted them to be in the story. I didn't want anything more than that. There's a 5-year age difference between the three of them, or between the two of them. Jyn was born in 21 BBY, and Cassian was born in 26 BBY, so I had to have fun with this story, and I got to have a chance to have Cassian grow up in the Empire. And the most fun that I had about this story, and I think it's one of the most fun things that I've done in a story lately, is that I got to tell like the insides and outs of the Empire. And a lot of that is inspired by Andor, because you don't get a lot of inside and out with the Empire. You know, the Imperial Army is the main bulk of the Empire. Stormtroopers are considered elite. You know, that's why the Stormtroopers are on the Death Star, because they're considered elite. Imperial Army troopers are the main bulk of the Empire. They're not Stormtroopers, they're just army. And I wanted to reference that and talk about that a little bit, and talk about how the Imperial Navy is a bit corrupt, and how, you know, if you were born on Coruscant and had the opportunity to go to an elite academy, that gives you a great placement into the military. And that's kind of, I guess, based on real life, and Star Wars is always based on real life. As someone that lives near the Naval Academy, I can tell you that usually if you go to that academy, you don't have to become a grunt. And that's kind of another part of the inspiration for this story, is that if you get into one of those really upper class academies, you get a greater placement into that particular whatever it is that you're joining. And I wanted to kind of carry that on this story, and also I wanted to mention how corrupt the Empire was, and how easy it was for someone to reach through the ranks, and how corrupt and and idiotic Imperial officials are. We get plenty of that in Rebels, and we get plenty of that in the actual story, the original trilogy itself, but I wanted to capitalize on that in this story by talking about someone that you don't know from Mimban, from a planet that really was a dreadful siege, and I tried to connect some other dots there by having, you know, the fun little name call out for Han Solo and Mimban and the whole besieging of Mimban, and kind of tying in the story together and saying, hey, look, these characters, they're in a very big galaxy, but, you know, they can still be in the same area as other characters, and the reference to Crimson Dawn. So I really, I'm not gonna lie, I had a lot of fun with this story. This story is a lot of fun for me just because of all the specific references that I could make that kind of tie the story back to the larger story without being a critical part of the larger story. Obviously, the plans that Cassian gives to the rebellion are helpful, and I think it would help the rebellion's progress, but I don't want it to be so catastrophic. I don't want it to be one of these Anakin stories where Anakin has a larger effect on everything that happens in the galaxy. This is about a character that doesn't greatly affect the galaxy unless he does something a little bit extraordinary, and that's what he does. He does a little something extraordinary that changes a little bit up and gives the rebellion the chance to stop, I guess, the sequels from happening. So anyways, I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.